Thanks, Adrian, David, Tim, for these reflections on Telos. This has been the warm-up band. Now we're moving to the main show. One of the accomplishments we've had at Telos is to move the basically philosophical, political, theoretical discussion in a way to include literature. And one of the authors we've been able to publish in translation is the German author Ernst Jünger, who's known particularly for some war memoirs, although his fiction goes far beyond that. But for that reason, I'm delighted that I can introduce Jake Siegel to talk about Jünger. Jake is a journalist, especially in tablet. He's also the editor and contributor to an anthology of veterans fiction, Fire and Forget. He is an Army combat veteran who spent time in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he is going to give us some thoughts on what it meant to read Jünger as a veteran. So, Jake, thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to start on an unoriginal note by extending my profound gratitude and thanks to Mary, both for what you've done for Telos and also your generosity to me and my family personally. So thank you very much, Mary. And thank you, Russell, for inviting me. It's an honor to speak here. Now, on the matter, and I'm sorry, I'll add one more caveat. I'm not going to replicate any kind of authentic Teutonic pronunciations, so I'll be Ernst Jünger all night. I just want to say that now. On the matter of Ernst Jünger and his legacy, let me begin with a question. Would it surprise any of you to learn that National Bolshevism has made something of a comeback online? Let me explain. Within the teeming multiplicity of the hyper-ironized cultural worlds of the internet, there's a small but highly visible contingent of National Bolsheviks. Now, they coexist with North Korean enthusiasts, with all sorts of esoteric varieties of fascists, Strasserites, and third positionists, Maoists, all of whom exist in these online subcultures mediated through often cartoon avatars, typically Japanese manga, and existing through many of the same forms of interaction that you find in other subcultures online. They produce memes. The content of those memes is evocative but often hard to parse. Its fundamental quality being how replicable it is, how much it induces its own replication. So the line in these politics, with the Nazbols, as they call themselves, and others, it's often difficult to parse where the joke ends and the earnest statement of political commitment encoded in irony ends. So it's not possible to say exactly who these National Bolsheviks are, but it's clear there's not many of them. They're not poised to take over America. They're not responsible for the populist movement that's been spoken about already. But they do have a kind of clear identity online, and they operate as something between a kind of juvenile, fourth generation Dadaist prank and an actual political tendency that they're struggling to describe, and that anonymity grants them the opportunity to express. It seems, insofar as you can trace what they're looking for inspiration, that it comes more from the party founded in the early 90s by Alexander Dugin and Edward Limonov in Russia, the National Bolshevist Party there. Now, many of you will recognize Dugin as the exponent of the so-called fourth position theory, fourth political theory, which purports to transcend the 20th century's liberal, communist, fascist trifecta in a kind of syncretic transcendence, mystical Eurasianism that gets past all of this. I won't even get into Limanov's politics. Limanov started off as a novelist, actually a very talented writer and something of a bohemian, later formed a party with Garry Kasparov. Won't even get into Limanov's politics. But this appears to be the proximate inspiration for the Nazbols who you can find on Twitter, on Reddit, and congregating in other spaces online. This matters for our purposes tonight because Dugin, for instance, has explicitly drawn inspiration from Ernst Jünger, who briefly flirted with the Weimar National Bolshevist Party and whose The Worker is a kind of seminal text for the people who have taken up that tradition now. Now, does this mean that Jünger has influenced young Americans to become National Bolsheviks in a serious way that's consequential for our politics? No, I don't think so. But I also think that, as Jünger would have noted, the serious and the unserious are getting harder to tell apart. And really, I think it's most relevant in the sense that it points to a kind of foundational crisis, a problem in liberalism itself, in the material conditions of liberalism, and in its foundational precepts, that insofar as it's no longer working, has allowed this effusion of other tendencies to surface. Some of them seem fairly conventional, the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, being more popular than they've been in decades is one instance of this. But there's also been this kind of Cambrian explosion of identities, and fractious, zealous political identities among them, particularly expressing themselves online, where there's no real stakes attached to this. And it has very much a certain interwar Weimar spirit. And I point this out in the sense that it points to an echo between our own time and some of the interwar cultural and political conditions from which Jünger came and in which he developed his ideas. Now, the title of this talk arranges a series of nouns: veteran, Jünger, post-liberal politics, Telos, in a way that promises a unifying account, which I'm not going to deliver. I don't have a unifying account to give you, I'm sorry. I'm not going to solve the riddle of Ernst Jünger tonight. I'm not even going to solve the riddle of Telos tonight. What I am going to try and do is present, maybe in the spirit of Jünger's The Adventurous Heart, and my weak approximation of his stereoscopic style, present a series of perspectives, a series of looks that hopefully will present both surface and depths, so that you can get some idea of a deeper field of truth. And I'm gonna start just by a quick reference to Adrian's talk, because something he mentioned about the ubiquity of secular rationalism or rational determinism as the foundation of liberal modernity, I think is relevant to Jünger in very obvious ways, but it's relevant to Jünger also in the fact that when you talk about Jünger, you have to say which Jünger, right? It's like a which Nietzsche kind of question. The Jünger of The Worker, the Jünger of On Pain, is not the Jünger of On Marble Cliffs, is not the Jünger of The Glass Bees, and is definitely not the Jünger of Ohmsville. Is the best I'm going to give that, okay. And it's definitely not the Jünger of Ohmsville. But what unites them, supposing that anything unites them, that there's a single Jünger that runs through all of these different works? I think what unites them is the question of nihilism. It's the basic Nietzschean question of where meaning comes from in a post-sacred world. In every one of these books, starting with Storm of Steel, there's a fundamental question of nihilism and of the foundation of meaning. Once the sacred horizon is lost, where meaning comes from, and also, as importantly, how meaning is ordered without a sacred horizon. What provides the vanishing point from which the perspective is drawn? And he provides a series of answers rather, throughout the course of this. And there's a pivot to the answers that Jünger provides about this question of nihilism, which, spoiler, he never resolves definitively. But the pivot, the way through which he answers this, I think is often the question of political loyalty. So you get this in books like The Forest Passage, and in this character of the anarch that Jünger later develops. It's a question of where in this post-sacred world, first where meaning comes from, and then where the individual owes their loyalty, how the individual vests themselves in something, demonstrating their duty and loyalty, through which meaning is synthesized, through which some version of the heroism of the past, of the enchanted nature of the pre-rationalist world can be recaptured. It's a long preface to what's now going to be a personal digression, because there is a personal story for me as regards Jünger. I was introduced to his work as a young veteran when I was recently back from Iraq, and my reading of Jünger at the time, and also my reading of Russell's introduction to Jünger, Russell's writing on Jünger has exerted a profound influence on me that continues to this day and shaped the way I have approached and understood the post-liberal ferment of our time. So I was in Iraq for about 14 and a half months in 2006 and 2007. This was during the period of the surge, which I experienced only indirectly, not through any interactions with Iraqis, which I barely had during that time, but largely through the volume and lethality of the roadside bombs with which I interacted. Those were the improvised explosive devices that my unit attempted to locate and bypass during our nocturnal operations, providing security for supply convoys. A little more than a year after I returned from Iraq, I was back in Brooklyn sharing an apartment in Crown Heights with a fellow veteran writer. That is the prodigiously talented writer Roy Scranton, who's since published a short track, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, and a novel, War Born. And it was Roy who gave me a copy of On Pain, and actually, Roy gave me this copy of On Pain, and told me simply, you have to read this, it'll blow your mind. And I started with On Pain, and it did. It blew my mind. And I've thought long since about what exactly it was that was so resonant in it, and what it says about me that I responded to it in the way that I did. But I think the fact that I'd encountered Jünger this way is notable for a few reasons, and one of them is sitting here, and it's my father. My father was an editor of Telos, and yet I was introduced to Jünger and really to Telos through my friend Roy. And as much as Paul was a fixture in my house, and I passed this photo, but in a kind of Technicolor red sweater on my stairwell throughout my childhood and adolescence, I'll admit to you now that in my early 20s, when I started reading seriously, I was not picking up Telos at the time, which was a little daunting. But it's important that I was introduced to it through Roy also because it shows how far the ideas Telos introduced had traveled in the world. They'd made it far enough that they reached my friend, an Army veteran from Oregon who landed in New York and was then at the New School, and then come back to me. So these were not cloistered academic notions. They were notions, and they were thinkers and currents that were traveling in the world. It's also notable because while my friend Roy has a broad, curious mind and isn't particularly obedient to any ideology, he's decidedly of the left, probably a full step and a half to the left of me, for instance. And yet, he was the one who had handed me Jünger. And this was in early 2009, and he'd done it with no compunction, with no lengthy series of caveats and disclaimers. He just said, you have to read this, it'll blow your mind. And once I got my hands on it, what was it that I was responding to? Well, the first and most obvious thing is the language, which even in translation retains some of the brute materiality that Jünger took from symbolist poetry. And the effect, which is not greatest in On Pain, which is not his great work of writing, but that I think comes through very clearly in On Marble Cliffs, and also you can see even in the earliest works, Storm of Steel. The language is original and it is singularly powerful. And so certainly we were responding to that, and we were responding to what Jünger himself described as his kind of photographic, the photographic effect of perception in the modern world, which seemed at the time to get past the sentimental morbidity that characterized a lot of serious war writing. And we were trying not to sentimentalize, and this offered a way that was neither stridently political or, we felt, a kind of burlesque of psychology. This was something else, and it was something that seemed to meet the experience of mechanized, mediated, computerized warfare in a medium that was expressive of its own reality. There were also the ideas, though, and the ideas come through very clearly beginning in On Pain. And these are ideas that really contain a kind of arch illiberalism and arch anti-humanism that I hadn't seen expressed in this way before reading Jünger. And I hadn't seen the effect that Jünger was able to bring, which was by drawing out the extreme, by taking some of the premises, the buried premises of liberalism to its logical conclusions. He exposed the inconsistencies, the way in which certain pieties had to be maintained as noble lies because they wouldn't survive a close examination. And I think this is best expressed in a passage from Russell's introduction to the Telos edition of On Pain that I'd like to read for you. Is there nonetheless a totalitarian trace in post-war democracy? Or rather, is post-war democracy thoroughly immune to totalitarian contamination? The claim that Jünger's description retains even partial viability today suggests that the post-totalitarian world, the democracies after Nazism and after communism, have been less than fully successful in retrieving the legacy of 19th century liberalism. To be sure, that classical liberalism may function as a norm for political thought and jurisprudence, but it does not map directly onto the operations of our own political institutions or the civic culture that subtends them. Jünger was able to identify some deep-seated illiberal tendencies in modernity, which came to the fore in the experience of the totalitarian movements and regimes, but which, stripped of the historical trappings of the Nazi era, continue to operate in contemporary culture. That was a way of understanding some of the congruences between these antithetical or seemingly antithetical political systems that I had previously only been exposed to by people who I frankly thought of as kind of shrill anti-American, shrill critics of empire, let's say, or shrill critics of capitalism, both from the left and right, either as a kind of exotic philosophical critique or what I felt was often a kind of shrill political critique. But what I found in Jünger was in the estrangement of it, the way in which the method was kind of strange and immediate and combined these depths and surfaces, a new framework. I want to read quickly a passage from my own short story from the collection Russell mentioned, Fire and Forget, because I think it shows the way that these echoes were there, these resonances were there, even before I had read Jünger. So in the story, there's one veteran character who's returned from Iraq talking to another veteran character. They're back in New York, they've returned home. And the one guy, the protagonist, is describing his nostalgia from combat. And he says, "I was talking about over there, how it felt when you got everything right. You could make the guns talk. Your words hardened into instruments controlling the machine. Everything moving like you told it to. When you got it right, there was a pure flow, thoughtless and unfeeling, unlike anything else." So in the years since I read Jünger initially and since I wrote that, I've been both deepening and revolting against that initial unwitting echo of Jünger and those resonances. I've been conflicted about being so moved by an anti-liberal, anti-humanist critique. And I have found some of my own ways of trying to reconcile that ambivalence, that conflictedness, wanting, frankly. The first way is to say, well, the analysis is powerful, but that doesn't mean I have to draw the same ethical conclusions or arrive at the same anti-humanist position. But, you know, frankly, if you take the analysis seriously enough, by the time you get to the point where you're making conclusions, you've already begun to sort of erode the ethical foundations from which you would have critiqued it. Doesn't mean I have become a Jungerian by any stretch of the imagination, but I've found this tension in myself, and it's something that I've played out. Another thing that happened was this original sense of estrangement that I had when I got back from Iraq, and when I was sort of most receptive to this Jünger critique and reading this stuff. It deepened over time, and my sense that liberalism was starting to come apart at the seams and that American liberal democracy was in a kind of crisis deepened, particularly after I got back from Afghanistan in 2012, when there had been at that point a 4-year-long, since the financial collapse of 2008, series of kind of networked, interlinked revolts and insurgencies in American politics leading up to this big populist movement of the last 2 years. And I think in a sense this has been a long time coming, and people who were really caught by surprise perhaps weren't paying close attention. And at the time when I got back in 2012, it looked to me like a landscape populated by Schmittians of the left and Gramscians of the right. And that didn't seem to portend for the long-term viability of Republican democracy and liberal democracy in America. And there were all these manifestations of that. And I began to look into them, and I began to follow various kinds of political protests in America as a journalist, and also to pay more attention to some of the growing movements online. That is the neo-reactionary movement that was growing online, that I began to feel had some significant consonances with the conservative revolution of the interwar years. And also a growing, what I've called Schmittians of the left, a growing kind of hardening left-wing identity politics, deeply invested in the idea of original sin, and deeply invested in what appeared to me to be only thinly veiled attempts to reallocate power based on identity as the primary means of determining where power ought to reside. So I wrote a series of articles on this and was examining all this, and it led up to a piece that I wrote recently on a character named Cody Wilson. And Wilson, for those of you who don't know, is the guy behind the 3D printed guns. He has a company called Defense Distributed, and he's the inventor of the so-called wiki weapon. And Wilson, who started off as a student of Proudhon, who's went on Glenn Beck's show and quoted Foucault, who talks about how he was reading Lenin in high school, is now a crypto-anarchist gun merchant who could best be described using the appellation Steve Bannon came up with as a conservative Leninist. And so in this post-liberal space, in this breakdown of the kind of rigid orthodoxies. First of all, in the crack-up of the center, which allows for this new examination of a kind of post-liberal political identity, as much space as that's opened up, some of the new right and the new left have landed in these kind of syncretic formations that have echoes both in their political content and in their relationship to technology, echoes of Jünger in particular. I wrote in this piece about Jünger and about Cody Wilson, this crypto-anarchist gun merchant, who I later found out had read Umsville, though I didn't know it at the time. But I wrote, Jünger began with a wish to see individualism subsumed in a totalizing state geared perpetually toward war. But he ended his life trying to save the individual from authoritarian mass society through the cultivation of a remote inner life. Somewhere between anarch and anarchist, Wilson oscillates between these unreconciled poles of Jünger's thought. So I thought at the time, oh, this guy, seems like a character out of a Jünger novel. I later found out that after I'd been assigned to this story, or after I'd pitched this story and started writing it, he'd been recommended Umsville by somebody and had started reading it. I've got the person who recommended Umsville to him, I believe used to be a National Bolshevik on Twitter. I believe that was his original political orientation, and is now a kind of Twitter literary critic. I started to think of this as a kind of reactionary postmodernism, borrowing Jeffrey Herf's term, reactionary modernism. And I thought of it as less an instantiation of Jünger's ideas as a kind of continuation of what he had diagnosed. But I come back to the question of National Bolshevism here, because the other, I think, important conceptual point that Jünger brings up is this problem of how to tell what's serious and when to be serious and when not to be serious. And much of the character of the anarch in the late novel Umsville is about this question of seriousness, and it's about where loyalties should be placed and about the way in which treating things as serious or treating things seriously confers a value to them that is a value judgment made by the individual that vests the individual in the systems around themselves, outside of themselves, and potentially by treating things as serious, it's a kind of slippery slope to dogma. But this problem of seriousness recurs again and again when I try to examine these political formations that I see. It's just not clear whether they know how serious they are, whether this question of seriousness is even operative anymore. And it's consequently not always clear to me how seriously they ought to be taken. And this gets back to a fundamental question, I think an epistemological question, which is, what is the source of meaning? It's, again, the problem of nihilism, in a way. What is the source of meaning? Without meaning, without a vanishing point of meaning, how do you create the perspective which would tell you what is serious and what is not serious? And I don't mean just the old modernist anxieties here, mixing of high and low, nor do I mean the conservative plaint about the coarsening of culture. I mean that increasingly in our relationships to the technology through which we live our lives and mediate our daily experiences, we're objects in a flood of information that levels hills and valleys and overpowers individual subjects caught in its current. And I mean that inside that current, inside the slipstream, it can be almost impossible to generate a stable perspective. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus is supposed to have said that no one can step twice into the same river. He wasn't thinking about the internet. Picture the roaring river again. Now imagine every drop of water is a reflective surface in an infinitely echoing ocean of mirrors. this is something closer to our own situation now. And the question of how to navigate in those currents and how to maintain a stable sense of a point on the shore by which to orient oneself is a question that Jünger had located almost 100 years ago. Finally, I want to say a few words about post-liberalism and then about Telos, and we'll close out. Liberalism, by its unique ability to absorb antithetical values, is threatened with becoming that which it absorbs. And this is, in the final analysis, where I end up in my own interpretation of some of Jünger's critique of liberalism. And I think is in part what Russell was getting at in his introduction to On Pain. What I mean by that is that unlike other systems that don't enshrine the idea of value pluralism, the legacies of positivism, communism, or systems with mythical, irrational devotions like fascism, liberals value pluralism, or a certain strain of liberal value pluralism threatens to become what it absorbs. And so, over time, can grow more and more distant from its foundational premises, but while maintaining the appearance of its foundational premises. Let me give you a concrete example. Why can't the United States leave Afghanistan? What are we trying to accomplish in Afghanistan at this point? Why are we still there? How many ill-conceived and destructive wars can be fought after Vietnam before they cease to be seen as a series of unrelated failures in decision-making and come to be understood as a very rational, very predictable expression of a deeper metapolitical and structural orientation? That the appearance of freedom, or the domestic freedom, the form of freedom that's maintained, relies on a counter-agonism, on a perpetual conflict. I look also at the figure of the bourgeois character, who Jünger, like a typical conservative revolutionary of the time, ruthlessly critiques as being concerned with security above all else. You know, in this respect, Jünger has a fairly conventional analysis. There's the bourgeois merchant who avoids pain and values security is Nietzsche's last man, essentially, is the bugman. But I believe he missed something there. And what he missed was the way, what he missed, I believe, illustrates this capacity liberalism has, this vulnerability in absorbing antithetical values to morph gradually into something else. He didn't recognize the way that bourgeois liberalism could absorb the appearance of pain and neuter it and make the collecting of traumas a kind of fetishistic status competition. The way that pain could appear to be valued and a means of acquiring status, the brandishing of pain would become actually a very important social signifier, while being totally divorced from the principle of pain he was trying to elucidate. Where finally does Telos land in all of this? I don't know. What I know is that my friend Roy, who I mentioned introduced me to Jünger, has a new book coming out called Total Mobilization, which he takes the title from Jünger, and it is a scathing critique of American militarism. He's far more anti-militarist than I am, for instance, far more anti-war than I would consider myself. But it is informed by his reading of Jünger, as the title suggests. By which I mean only that the Telos broadness, the Telos refusal to idle into a dogma, promotes clear and critical thinking and is incredibly valuable. And there's a counter tendency to believe in an almost superstitious way that by burying Jünger, the ideas that Jünger is expressing will go away, that they'll wither and die. In fact, the opposite is true. They'll gain a kind of occult power that they might be robbed of by a clear elucidation and a clear analysis. And so, if, as I do, you still have attachments to liberal humanism, some of the principles involved, it's important to engage in a ruthless critique. And it's important to understand that liberal humanism most certainly won't survive if it tries to sleepwalk into the next century, and if it rests on pieties that have long been exposed as fundamentally incapable of withstanding these repeated perennial onslaughts and crises of modernity. And so Telos, in its relentless commitment to exploring ideas, to refusing to settle into a kind of ideological obedience, brings truth to the surface. And the truth I derive from Jünger is a difficult one, and it's one that I still wrestle with. But it hasn't made me a fascist. And I believe it's made me smarter and stronger in my own commitments. Thank you.
Jake, thanks for that wonderful talk. Sheds a lot of light on Jünger and on our historical moment and on Telos. Fascinated by this question of seriousness, which reminds me of that phrase that circulated during the presidential, or in the aftermath of the presidential election, of those who took the winner seriously but not literally, or literally and not seriously. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, as there's lots of wisdom in what you presented to us. So thank you again. I know that there are lots of questions that can be pursued, but I also know that there's a reception waiting for us outside. And I also know that our time in this room is limited till 7:30. So why don't we eat, drink, and be merry and discuss in that context. Thanks so much for coming.